Okay, it's 7:30, and all of us good project managers know we start on time, right? So we will. Hopefully, folks will join us. I'm Professor John Jones. For those of you who are not in my class or haven't had me, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Professor Feisenmeyer. And I think we'll start with our guest speaker. Um, no problem. And We'll go from there, and we'll pick up, and Professor Feisenmeyer and I can fill in any blanks that Eric Nelson, our guest speaker, may not share or discuss in his presentation. He'll be about 30, 45 minutes. Um, and feel free to Q&A. I'll let Eric decide if he wants to take questions throughout or if you want to save them till the end. You can share that with us. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Eric Nelson, who is a former student, now an alumni, a fellow Trojan of you all. And I'll just say, take it away. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Jones, and thank you, Professor Feisenmeyer, as well, for having me. It's a real honor to be back at USC, even if it's for only about an hour. Happy to see everyone. Welcome to week three. Just have a little presentation to talk about. So let me share my screen here. And Professor Jones, let me know if everyone can see my screen.
You're good. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Well, my name is Eric Nelson. I'm a project manager, a major in the Army Reserve, and an author of a book called The Unchained Operator. And not that long ago, I was actually sitting exactly where you were. Actually graduated in December, and I was trying to figure out exactly how much of what I was learning would actually matter once I got into the real world. And I'll give you an honest answer up front. Most, if not all of it, does matter. And I do use the material from this master's program every single day. It actually just doesn't show up the way you might think it will. And over the last few years, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why execution breaks inside organizations, not from a theoretical perspective, but in real environments where there's deadlines, competing priorities, limited resources, and actual consequences if things don't work out. And I ended up writing a book around it, not because I set out to write a book, but because I kept seeing the same patterns over and over again, and I needed a way to make sense of it. So let me start with something pretty simple here. Have you ever been in a meeting where everyone's talking, plan sounds good, and people are aligned, but then you walk out thinking, all right, so what actually happens now? And then nothing does. And I've been in more of those meetings than I can actually count. And if I'm being honest, if meetings alone drove execution, every organization would be operating at an extremely high level, but they're not. Most organizations don't actually have an execution problem, they have a system problem. And the reason that matters is because most organizations try to fix execution the wrong way. They ask people to work harder, they add more meetings, they create more reporting, they increase pressure. And none of that actually improves outcome because execution doesn't fail due to effort. It fails because the system surrounding the work was never actually designed to produce the outcome in the first place. And this is where what you're learning in this program, especially at USC, becomes really important because you're being introduced to concepts like organizational maturity, capacity models, structured approaches to change. And those aren't just academic ideas, they're real tools. But what I want to do tonight specifically is to show you where some of those tools start to break down, not because they're wrong, but because they're incomplete. And if you don't see that early, you'll spend a lot of time doing the right things and still not getting the results that you expected. And on paper, maturity models make a lot of sense. you assess an organization across people, process, data, and technology. And you define levels, you create a shared language, and you establish a baseline. And that's valuable because it gives you a way to see the system. And what those models are really trying to measure, if you strip them down, is readiness. How capable an organization actually is at producing outcomes through its people, its process, its data, and its technology. And just as important, the consistency that's behind it. And not whether something works once, but whether it works repeatedly under different conditions. Because that's what maturity is supposed to represent, not structure, but reliable performance. But here's what those models don't tell you. They don't tell you what happens when pressure hits the system. And pressure always hits the system. Deadlines compress, priorities collide, and resources get pulled in different directions. And when that happens, you don't see the model, you see behavior. And that behavior doesn't happen randomly. It's shaped by culture. What people believe is acceptable, what gets rewarded, and what gets ignored. And even more specifically, it's shaped by the leadership climate, the tone that leaders set day to day, how decisions get made, and how pressure is handled. That's what actually determines whether a system holds or breaks. And you get to see whether ownership is real or if it's just written down. And you see whether people move forward or if they wait, or whether work continues or if it just stalls out. And that's maturity, not the presence of process, but the ability to produce outcomes when conditions aren't ideal. And this is where the disconnect happens. Because you can have a mature looking organization with documentation, structure, governance, and still have an execution system that breaks the moment it's stressed. Because no one's actually operating it. So, so I started asking a different question. If organizations have structure, they have leadership, why does execution still feel fragile? Why does it depend on specific people? Why does it slow down so easily? And what I realized there's a gap in almost every organization that I've worked in. Not a gap in strategy, not a gap in effort, but a gap between what gets planned and what actually gets done. And if you look at this at the top, that's where organizations spend most of their time. Strategy, alignment, and plans. And they're usually pretty good at it. Clear direction, solid plans. Everyone walks out aligned. And then you drop down to the bottom. And that's where the work is supposed to happen. Tasks getting done, deliverables are moving, and there's actual progress. And what organizations assume those two are connected. Like if the plan's good enough, execution should just follow, right? But that's not what actually happens. Because in between those two layers, that's where things start to break. Decisions slow down, ownership becomes unclear, and now priorities start competing with each other. And you see movement, but that's not always the right movement. You get busy without getting closer to the outcome. And the tricky part is on paper, everything still looks fine. The plan exists, structure's there, everyone's doing their job. The execution is still off. So the question becomes, what actually connects the top to the bottom? What makes sure that the plan turns into results? And this is where the shift happened for me. The answer wasn't in the process, it was in the roles. And when I started breaking this down, this is the model that came out of it. And at first glance, it looks simple. You have managers, you have leaders, and you have operators. But this distinction is where everything starts to shift. Now, managers work in the system. They're responsible for tasks, timelines, and coordination. And they keep things moving at the tactical level. And organizations need that. Leaders work on the system. They set the direction, they align the people, and they create the vision. Organizations really need that as well. But here's the gap. None of those roles is explicitly responsible for making sure the system itself produces outcomes. And that responsibility is usually assumed or spread across people or left to the process. And that's where things break. Operators design and run the system. They don't assume clarity, they create it. They don't wait for decisions, they make them. And they don't accept the system as fixed, they change it. And most importantly, they own the outcome, not the task, not the alignment, but the outcome. And once you start looking at organizations through this lens, you begin to see it everywhere. You see teams that are busy, but not efficient. And you see alignment without movement. And you see plans that never fully materialize, not because people aren't capable, but because no one's actually operating the system at that level. So once I started seeing that, the next question became, what does it actually look like to operate a system? Not in theory, but in real time. Because if you think about how organizations are supposed to move from strategy to execution, they don't do it through projects alone. They do it through capabilities. What does the business actually need to be able to do consistently over time to achieve this strategy? And that's where capability road mapping comes in. It forces organizations to think beyond short-term work and define the actual abilities they need to build across the enterprise. But here's the problem. Even when those capabilities are defined, they still don't execute themselves. They still rely on a system that has to function in real time. And if that system isn't designed to support those capabilities, the roadmap never becomes reality. And as you can see here, execution doesn't happen in a straight line. It doesn't go from plan to action to result. It actually moves in a loop. And the reason for that matters. It's because if any part of this loop breaks, everything slows down. And it starts with intent. And this is where systems quietly fail. Because intent exists, but it's not precise. It's interpreted differently across teams. It shifts depending on who you talk to. And what you end up with is the illusion of alignment. Everyone nods, everyone agrees, but no one is actually operating from the exact same understanding. So the operator has to force clarity, not once, but continuously. What are we actually trying to achieve? What matters most right now? And what does success look like? Not in general, but in this moment. And second is cadence. And this is where execution either finds a rhythm or it falls apart. Because without cadence, work becomes reactive. People meet when something goes wrong, and decisions happen when pressure builds and momentum becomes inconsistent. And cadence changes that. It creates a predictable rhythm where work moves forward regardless of conditions. And then you have checkpoints. And this is where you confront reality, not the plan, not the status report, but reality itself. Are we actually making progress, or are we just completing tasks? Because those are not the same things. And then feedback. And this is one of the biggest differentiators between high performing and low performing systems. How quickly does the system learn? How quickly does it adjust? And how quickly does information move? Because the speed of feedback determines the speed of execution. And finally, you have friction. And friction is not a sign of failure, it's a constant. The difference is how it's handled. Now, most organizations try to absorb friction. They work around it, they tolerate it. Operators try to remove it. They simplify, they eliminate unnecessary steps, and they reduce dependency. And they clear the path so work keeps moving. And then the loop continues. And this is what creates momentum, not effort, not pressure, but a functioning system. And here's where things get even more subtle, because even when a system like this exists, organizations still get it wrong. And the reason is how they interpret what they're seeing. Now, let me give you a real example of what this looks like in real time. Now, right now in the Army Reserve, I'm serving as a logistics officer. So I'm responsible for logistics across multiple dispersed units all across the country. And we're currently in the middle of a pretty big unit transition. And on paper, everything looks fine. We're receiving guidance, we're receiving orders from our higher command, and there's a plan that I created based on what I learned in this program. But execution isn't moving the way it should. And one of our biggest issues right now is something pretty simple, is we don't have our unit identification codes. And without those, we can't transfer equipment, we can't make purchases, and we can't actually operate under the new unit structure. So everything is staged, everything's ready, but nothing moves. And that's a perfect example of the difference between being busy and actually executing. And then you layer an authority. Now we fall under a higher command, so we can't just push and say, hey, we need this faster. We have to wait on them. And that slows everything down. Not because people aren't working, but because the system itself doesn't allow us to move. And then you get into the people side. We're trying to close out statements of charges and other administrative items before a change of command to the new unit that's scheduled for July, so we can start cleaning. That's only about a month and a half away. But some of our subordinate commanders won't move unless the brigade commander himself tells them directly. And that creates a bottleneck. Now, instead of things moving through the system, everything gets tied to one person's time. So what do we actually do? Well, we adjust, we keep our trackers updated, we work with our full-time staff, we negotiate across units, and we keep progress moving on the things that we can control. But we're consistently working around constraints. And when you step back and look at it, this isn't a motivation problem. It's not a planning problem, but it's a system problem. We have dependencies that aren't resolved. We have authority that's misaligned. And we have decision bottlenecks built into the structure. And until those things change, execution is always going to be slower than it should be. And if you think back to the operator system loop we just talked about, the intent is there, cadence exists, we're checking things, but friction is dominating the system. And when friction dominates, everything slows down. And now here's the part that actually matters. If you looked at it from the outside, you'd see a lot of activity. Meetings are happening every week at the same time. Coordination between units, contractors, and facilities are ongoing, and there's no lack of effort from anyone involved in this process. And you probably think things are progressing, but that's not the same as outcomes. And this is where most change efforts quietly fail. Because if you look at the data, only a small percentage of organizations are actually effective at enabling change. And when you break down why, it's not because they don't have frameworks. They usually have the milestones, they have the metrics, they have executive sponsors, and they have governments. What they don't have is a system that can carry that change all the way through to an outcome. So the change gets announced, it gets structured, gets tracked, and then it stalls inside the system. So here's the shift. What I just described is what it looks like when a system is full of friction. But the signals you're using to judge progress don't actually tell you that. Because inside that environment, if you just look at what's visible, it all looks like it's working. People are busy, meetings are happening, trackers are getting updated. And from the outside, nothing looks broken. And that's where organizations get fooled. They think they're progressing because they're measuring the wrong things. So if you really want to understand why execution slows down, even when effort is high, you have to look at what you're actually measuring, because not all metrics are created equal. And if you don't understand the difference, you'll manage activity, but you'll completely miss the outcomes. And this is one of the most common traps in execution. And it's one of the hardest to see while you're in it. Because organizations, they'll measure activity because it's visible, because it's immediate and it's easy to track. You can count tasks, you can count hours, and you can count meetings. And when those numbers are high, it can feel like progress, but activity doesn't always equal progress. It just means something's happening. And then you move up to outputs. You have deliverables, you have milestones and artifacts. And this feels better because now something tangible exists. But outputs don't guarantee impact. You can deliver everything on time, on scope, and still fail because nothing actually changed. And at the top, you have outcomes. And outcomes are uncomfortable because they force a different question. Not, did we complete the work, but did what we produced matter? What changed? What improved? What's different because this work happened? And that's where value's proven. And that's where operators focus, even when it's harder to measure and even when it takes longer to see. Because if the outcome isn't changing, the system isn't working. And if you've ever been on a project where everything looked like it was working, status reports were green, deliverables were on track, and everyone was busy, then at the end, it didn't actually deliver value. This is why. Now, let me show you what this looks like when the stakes are actually real. I led an enterprise implementation for the Virginia Department of Health for their statewide vaccine registry system. We had over 50 million records and an $8 million contract. And we had an 11-month timeline because their existing vendor contract was expiring, whether we were ready for it or not. There was no extension, no fallback. And if we missed, the state of Virginia risked not having a functioning vaccine registry. And that would cause very real consequences if that happened. And a project like this usually takes about 2 to 3 years. We had 11 months. And that wasn't even the hardest part of this project. Right before kickoff, my company had a major project completely unravel right before go live. And that failure didn't stay contained within the company. It spread across the organization. Morale dropped immediately. Trust broke down. Work streams became siloed, and people stopped talking to each other. And when they did, it wasn't collaborative. It was defensive. So when we kicked off Virginia, I wasn't walking into a clean environment. I was walking into a system that had already lost confidence in itself, which meant I wasn't just executing one project. I was executing two at the same time. We had the long-term mission to deliver Virginia in 11 months. And the immediate mission, which was to stabilize the system that was supposed to deliver it, I had to get people talking again, rebuild trust fast, and reconnect the work streams that had already started drifting apart before we even got moving. Because without that, nothing else mattered. And on paper, we still had everything you're supposed to have. We had a roadmap, we had stakeholders, defined processes and governance structures. But under that level of pressure, none of that executes itself. And what actually started happening was exactly what you'd expect in a system under stress. Workstreams started optimizing for their piece instead of the outcome. Dependencies weren't being surfaced fast enough, and decisions slowed down at the exact moment we needed speed. And this is where most organizations go wrong. They respond by adding more process, more meetings, more reporting layers. But we did the opposite. We operated the system. Decisions were pulled forward and not delayed. And if something was unclear, we clarified it immediately instead of documenting it for later. And we forced connection between work streams instead of letting them operate in silos. And if integration was at risk, it became the priority, not just another task. And we compressed decision cycles and we removed unnecessary escalation paths. We made ownership in the project extremely clear. And friction, because there was a lot of it, was treated as something that was to be removed in real time, not just something to track. And in parallel, we were rebuilding our team. We were restoring communication, reestablishing trust, and creating enough alignment so people could actually move together again. And that didn't happen through process. It took leadership, it took discipline, and it took someone actively operating the system every day, knowing exactly what needed to be done to make sure it happened. And there was no point where we stepped back and said, oh, let's see if this process worked. No, we made it work. And in that room, it looked like constant alignment conversations, hard trade-off decisions, and moments where there wasn't a perfect answer, but a decision still had to be made. Because momentum mattered more than perfection. And that's the difference. That wasn't change management as a concept. This was execution under constraint. And it proved something very clearly to me. The frameworks are useful, but they don't carry the outcome. The system does. And more importantly, someone has to be actively operating the system the entire time. So if you step back from all of this, this is what organizational change actually is. Every organization has a system, and that system is perfectly designed to produce the outcomes it's currently producing, even if those outcomes aren't what you want. So when organizations say they want change, what they're really saying is they want different outcomes. But here's the problem. They try to get those outcomes without changing the system. They communicate more. They train people. They increase oversight. But the underlying system stays the same. And because of that, the results stay the same. Real change requires redesign. Now, ownership has to shift, decision rights have to move, and metrics have to change. Because those are the layers that actually drive behavior. And execution is the system producing outcomes, not activity, not alignment, but outcomes. So as you move forward in this program, this is the gap that you're walking into. You're going to walk into organizations that look mature. They'll have frameworks, they'll have roadmaps, and they'll have processes, and they will still struggle. Not because they lack knowledge, but because the system isn't being operated. And this is where you come in. Your value won't come from knowing more frameworks. It'll come from your ability to step into ambiguity, to create clarity, to own decisions, and to keep execution moving forward. Because at the end of the day, change doesn't come when people agree. It happens when the system changes and the outcomes follow. And everything I talked about today comes from real environments like the ones that I just described. And I put it in a book, not as a theory, but as something that you can actually use in those situations. And if what I talked about today was useful to you, this is where it lives. And I do appreciate your time and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Eric, for coming and sharing your expertise with us. Let me do